say, Pastor B, you're stretching it a little bit. Well, I don't think so. I don't think so. Let me tell you about a book I read one time. It's called Eternity in Their Hearts by Don Richards. That book is filled with stories about how God, over the years, has faithfully preceded all of our missionaries in foreign countries where they've never heard the gospel. I don't think I'm saying his name right, but there was an Inca chief I read about by the name of Pachahuca, I believe that's right, who worshiped the sun. He found no fulfillment in that. As an intelligent man, he began to reason in himself, and his logic caused him to see and understand that the sun that he worshiped was not immutable. In other words, that the sun was not unchanging. In fact, he noted that on a cloudy day, the clouds could cover the sun where you couldn't see the sun. And with those kind of acts of nature in God's creation, he began to reason logically that the sun couldn't be God, because to be God, you've got to be unchanging. He logically concluded that. That's pretty smart. Pretty much. So what he did through the process of his logic was he developed a name for an immutable God who was unchanging, that he could worship and could praise and call on, and who would meet his needs. And Don Richardson writes that years later, missionaries ended up among that Inca tribe, and as they told about Jesus, Pachahuca said, "That's the God that I've been worshiping." That gives me cold chills. Our God is great. Everybody say, God is great.
God is great.
Everybody say, God is unlimited.
God is unlimited.
He is. So he says to the pagan, you're without excuse. God will reveal himself through conscience and through nature. So, in other words, every human being has, as Don Richardson says, eternity in their hearts. So Paul says to the pagan, you're guilty. Well, you'll love this part. Then he comes in chapter 2, and he brings the Gentile into the courtroom. And he says, you're indicted. And he says, I'm getting ready to prove you guilty and without excuse, because he says, as a Gentile, he said, you sin. Watch this now. He says, you sin without the law. In other words, they didn't know the law of Moses. They didn't know the Mosaic law. They didn't know the 10 Commandments. But he said, watch this. He said, you sin without the law. And Paul says, here's my logic. He said, as a Gentile, in your civic life as human beings, in your culture, he said, you create your own, you write your own civil laws. Like in America, we have certain laws, right? You break the laws, what happens? You get arrested. Or if you're like me and you're driving down Hammer and Marco, talking on your cell phone because you don't have Bluetooth, because you're too cheap to buy one, and you get pulled over by a motorcycle officer and you get a ticket because you broke the law. If you don't mind loaning me $150, I'll pay my fine next week. And Paul says, listen, to the Gentile, he says, listen, you're without excuse and you're guilty before God, because he said, you've written all these civil laws, and he said, you know from experience, you don't keep those civil laws perfectly. So Paul's logic is, how in the world, if you can't keep laws you wrote yourself, how can you keep the law of God? Isn't that good? This is one smart cookie here we're talking about named Paul. Very logical. So he says to the Gentile, you're guilty too. You're sentenced to eternal judgment and death in hell. Guilty. That's bad news. Everybody say bad news.
Bad news.
Bad. Well, then Paul, who is a Jew. So, by the way, he brings the Jews into the courtroom and he says, you guys are guilty too. And here he implies, he says, and your response to me, now because you're a Jew, you know we have the Mosaic law, and we teach the law, and we tell people the law. And you got those Pharisees, you know, that were called the bruised and battered Pharisees because they were always running into buildings, because they were walking such a straight line with their eyes straight ahead, trying to obey the letter of the law in every fashion, and trying to catch people who weren't keeping the law. That's why they called them the bruised and battered Pharisees. Paul says, you guys come on. you go into the book of Romans, you find out Paul will say, come on, guys, give me a break. Nobody knows the law better than I do. Nobody received the law better than I did. Nobody has tried to convey the law in their life and obey the law in their life the way I have. In fact, you'll read in Romans where Paul says, I found that I kept the law, the letter of the law to the T. Pause. Except. The C word of God. Paul says the one area of my life that I could not keep the letter of the law was, he said, I have a problem with coveting what other people have. And he says to those Jews in the courtroom, I'm guilty and you know you're guilty. Some of you men, you've never committed adultery physically in the act of a woman, but you have thought about it and you have lived it out in your mind. You're guilty. Mine was covetousness, yours is lust. Mine was covetousness, yours was stealing. Some of those very men, if you look at the earthly ministry of Jesus, some of those very men that Paul's condemning in that courtroom stole from their own parents' estates by lying about it. Jesus condemned them for that. So Paul says, you guys, you know you're guilty. You're all. Because you have the law. It's all spelled out. You'll not know that God's before. You'll not steal. You'll not kill. You'll not bear false witness against your neighbor. That shall not bear false witness. I mean, you got all that law. He said, just like me, you got one or more. Didn't you? He says, you're all guilty. Now do you see why Romans 3:23 is so powerful? Paul sums it up. He's got the pagans over here, and he's got the Gentiles over here, and the Jews over here. And God, the judge, is on the bench. He says, God, I've made my case. They're all guilty. God says, correct. Paul says, that's bad news. Let me tell you something, pagan. Let me tell you something, Gentile. Let me tell you something, Jew. The good news is Jesus Christ, who was prophesied that he would come as he was prophesied, came as it was said that he would, and he died as they said that he would, and he rose as they said that he would. He's alive today as they said he would be, and he is the only defense you have in this case. And if you want the guilty verdict, if you want a verdict of acquittal in your situation, in your life, he said the only way you're going to get it is right now. Turn your life over to Jesus. Because if the Son sets you free, you're free indeed. Mel, is that right? Does Jesus set people free? Scott, does Jesus set people free? Jackie, does Jesus set people free?
Amen.
There you go. And every one of you can give that testimony. And what Paul really says here is, I've got an airtight case. I read to you from my book, Dark Night, Bright Morning, that's in the print shop right now. Our hope is in a month to have a book signing here at the church. But in my book, Dark Night, Bright Morning, I compared our story and our long wait to go to trial. We waited 3 years, 3 months, and 18 days to go to trial after our son was arrested for attempted murder in Florida. Did you get that? We waited 3 years, 3 months, and 18 days after his arrest for trial. I say in the book, it's interesting to compare our story and long wait to go to trial with the assassination of William McKinley, who was the 25th President of the United States.